Okay, well, let's begin. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 5th program in the Boston Green Ribbon Commission's GRCx series, Participatory Climate Justice Planning. My name is Amy Longsworth. With my colleague John Cleveland, we co-staff the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, which is a group of business, institutional, and civic leaders in Boston working to accelerate the implementation of the Boston City Climate Action Plan. The GRCx is an interactive program series that we launched recently designed to accelerate the implementation of the Climate Action Plan, the same goal, by providing high quality and useful content on climate resilience and carbon mitigation to the Boston community. So today's program, as usual, will feature an hour's worth of presentations, and we have 4 presenters today, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A from you. We will try to fit in as many questions as possible. Please type your questions into the chat box. That's the way to get your questions in. I'd like to introduce our panelists and thank our panelists for joining us this morning. We have Joan Fitzgerald, a professor of public policy and urban affairs at Northeastern University. Her work focuses on urban climate action and strategies for linking it to equity. She is the author of many books and has argued that the climate strategies of too many cities represent random acts of greenness rather than integrated and aggressive action, and that not enough focus is placed on racial justice in climate action planning. Leah Bamberger, who is the Director of Sustainability for the City of Providence, Rhode Island, and formerly a member of the Boston Environment, Energy, and Open Space staff, so we consider her an alum, is working to identify opportunities to reduce the City of Providence's energy costs, working with community groups, residents, businesses, to implement the first comprehensive sustainability action plan. And she has prioritized centering racial equity in this work. So in 2019, Providence came out with their equity and sustainability, and based on the work of the Equity and Sustainability Initiative, which was started in 2016, the Climate Justice Plan was released in Providence in 2019. Monica Huertas, unfortunately, was unable to join us today. We have recently learned. We're going to miss Monica's voice because she worked closely with Leah, representing the community as a participant in the Climate Just Providence Plan. And I think that Leah is going to represent some of what Monica would have said, but we're sorry that she's not here herself. Moving on to the City of Boston, Kat Eschel, who is carbon neutrality program of the city, carbon neutrality program for the city, and really, I will say the architect of the 2019 Climate Action Plan update, is managing the emissions greenhouse gas inventory, supporting Air Pollution Control Commission's work, collaborating with other city departments, and just across the board, seeing to the business of implementing the Climate Action Plan. Zoe Davis, who recently joined the staff at the Environment Department in the city as a climate resilience project coordinator, is going to be focusing on heat and the urban canopy, and we look forward to hearing more about that prospective work. She recently came from the Mystic River Watershed Association, where she organized restoration projects in public parks and partnered with community groups. So welcome, Zoe. I think with that, and I hope you can remember everyone, I'd like to turn it over to Joan to talk about her recent research into cities that are taking the lead in climate justice planning and sort of how you're parsing those and beginning to think about how that structure works. Joan.
Thank you. Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, John and Amy and the Green Ribbon Commission for hosting these workshops. I'm delighted to be here. Next slide. So, as Amy mentioned, I recently published a book, Greenovation: Urban Leadership on Climate Change, that examines leadership in North American and European cities, looking for ways to accelerate climate action given the urgency of the situation. But a book is never done, and once it's published, you're always on to the next thing. And my next book is called Climate Just Cities, and I'm presenting some of the preliminary work that I've been doing for that. So the first question I ask myself, that anyone asks, well, how do you know if a city is really embracing climate justice as a goal in its work? And so part of it is about what they say, how they go about doing it, and ultimately what they do. And so my question then was, okay, how do I operationalize that? How do I consistently examine that in several cities to look at the extent to which they really are taking equity seriously as a goal? And this isn't just my point of view. There are a lot of people in the field doing research on this, and we've come up with a set of factors. Next slide. Looking at climate justice planning requirements. So the first one, when doing a climate action plan or an update to a climate action plan, there has to be some level of recognition. What were the historic inequities and their impact on frontline communities? This is referred to as kind of a structural equity. And this is really important because there's a lot of fads in planning, innovation, all kinds of zones and different things that we do. But you can't fix what is broken unless you know what you did to get where you are. And that's why it's really important for recognition to be at the forefront of a city's approach to climate equity. Next. The next element has to be participation, and authentic participation that gives residents of frontline communities the power to co-create the goals and strategies of a plan. This is referred to as procedural equity. And this can even go further. And what some places are doing is community science, where community members are actually part of the data collection process on looking at the problems in their communities and how to fix them. But at a minimum, there's a co-creation of the goals and strategies. Next. The third element is metrics and an ongoing process for measuring outcomes, because plans are great, but it's the outcomes that are the critical aspect of equity planning. So how does that city go about making sure that those goals are being met is the third element. And then next. The fourth element has to do with distributional equity. And different people talk about that in different ways. We have an ongoing national discussion about reparations, remedies. For those of you who have read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, he talks about remedies to the housing discrimination that occurred in the United States. But it's a more limited set of factors that can be redistributed in climate action, but still it should be related to the wrong that was done. And it's not always easy to undo. So for example, one of the things we know that many frontline communities have been isolated by highways. Well, you can't take away the highways. So it's looking at what you can do in those situations. So with those as my requirements in mind for examining cities, I've had many conversations with Nils Moe from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and other network organizations of cities that are focusing on climate change to identify several cities that are in the process or have recently updated their climate action with an emphasis on equity. So one is Austin, Texas, which hasn't yet released the new plan. Baltimore, Cleveland, Portland, and Providence were the cities. Next. So when we talk about participation, one of the classic articles in urban planning is Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Public Participation. And her premise was that most of what we call in the field of urban planning participation gives residents no power, or at best is tokenism, but that it really doesn't speak to the needs of the people in the neighborhoods. It's just informing them of what you're going to do, and not really attempting to change anything that you want to do as a city as a result of that information. And it's only when you get up to the 3 levels in blue here of citizen power that we're really partnering with citizens, actually giving them some power, perhaps in implementation or citizen control. This has been a useful framework for many years, but there have been a lot of criticisms of it, that the boundaries between the areas are rather fuzzy, and that not all participation is about citizen control. And so other measures have been developed. And next. The one I use is one developed by the International Association of Public Participation, informed by Arnstein. But what I find so interesting about this, that it looks at the goal of the city in mind, and then what is the promise to the public? And hopefully those line up. So we see we started informed to provide the public with balanced and objective information, assist them in understanding the problem. So at the level of inform, they really aren't looking for citizen participation, just we're going to keep you informed. And then we see this moves up to consult, to obtain public feedback on analysis, alternatives or decision. That's keeping you informed, but also trying to acknowledge concerns. Now notice it doesn't say to do anything about them, just to acknowledge them. Then we move up to involve, to work directly with the public, so that their concerns are understood and considered, not necessarily incorporated, but considered in the process. So then we move up to collaborative, that really does have more back and forth exchange, and allowing residents to actually have some input into the final result. And the final one in this is empower, which is actually placing the final decision-making in the hands of the public. And so you can see it's very similar to Arnstein, and actually states here, we will implement what you decide. We'll hear from Leah in a little bit to see that they've taken this even further in the work that they're doing, but this is an important step, being able to implement. Next slide. Okay, so looking at the 5 cities, this is the way we were able to classify what they were doing. So in the case of Baltimore, there were a lot of community meetings held, but they really weren't of the nature where the residents were co-creating the goals. We move up to collaboration in the case of Portland, Cleveland, and Austin in very different ways. Portland sought to bring various groups to the table and they were participating in the goal setting similarly in Cleveland. And then moving on to empower, and the category that Leo will probably talk to is moving beyond empower to actually deferring to. So in this case, it may not be that the city would have prioritized different actions that the residents wanted, but that they put those priorities forward despite that. And I put Austin there with a question mark because their plan isn't completely done yet, so it's not 100% clear at this point what they've been able to include from the residents. And I will add that Austin has been doing this during the pandemic. And so they had a process like many of the cities did, where people were invited to meetings over anywhere from 3 months to 18-month period. Often meals would be provided, childcare would be provided during these meetings. And in almost all of the cities except Baltimore, residents were paid for their time, or the community group that was represented by the residents were paid for their time to engage in the planning process. And that proved to be a very important point, in that we often say we want citizen participation, but to do the kind of collaborate, empower, takes quite a few meetings, and you're asking people to volunteer their time while people from the city are being paid for their time. So that has been a very important factor in this. Austin had to go to online in the middle of it and has just done an amazing job of maintaining that participation under very difficult circumstances. Let me just add one other element that all of the cities did prior to first recognizing in their plans and in their outreach that they were reaching out to frontline communities, those communities who had borne the brunt of much of the pollution, whether it's from highways, port facilities, wastewater treatment plants, power plants, and so forth. And then taking their staff through one or more anti-racism trainings so that the staff were really in a better position to reach out and work with community members. So in this case, all of the cities did that to some extent. Next slide. So the next step in this analysis was to look at the actual plans and identify the extent to which equity is a concern. And so you can see in the first one, Austin, their plan was from 2015, updated in 2020. So let me tell you a little bit about these categories we used. The first one was absent. You go through a plan and equity just isn't mentioned at all. We searched not just equity, but several terms related to equity, and then examined the context in which they were mentioned. The second category was isolated, that maybe there was mention of equity under, say, urban heat island, or related to energy. It might be something about energy burden, that is the percentage of income that people in the neighborhood paid for their utilities, but isolated just in specific aspects of the plan. The next category was integrated, and that is equity was mentioned as an overarching theme in the beginning of the plan. It was mentioned after the recognition that there was an equity problem partially created by previous rounds of city planning efforts, and integrated holistically so that it just didn't come up in a few areas of the plan. And then the final aspect we were looking at was that the climate action plan update actually had metrics, or a statement that metrics were going to be developed to assess how well the equity goals were achieved. And of course, these are just the plans. They haven't, for the most part, been implemented yet, or haven't been implemented very long. So we were just looking for a process having been identified. Next slide. Well, just briefly on this. So what you see in this chart is that in every city, we moved from basically isolated to being both integrated and evaluated. And for our purposes, a plan had to be integrated and evaluated in order to meet our standard of really taking equity seriously. Next slide. Okay, so looking at what are the metrics that we might be looking for, partly it would be the goals in each of the plan's areas. So for example, if you were talking about renewable energy, there had to be specific reference to what the city was going to do to establish renewable energy in frontline neighborhoods. Sometimes it might be through community solar projects. Sometimes it might be through joint purchasing agreements. Similarly with energy retrofits, what specifically was being done in low-income housing. If a city is focusing on electric vehicles, what did the plan have to say about how those would be adopted in frontline neighborhoods? Next. Another way of measuring the metrics and outcomes would be the projects started in frontline communities. And I think this was really important in the cities that were a little ahead of this, to demonstrate to the communities, okay, we came up with this plan, but we really are going to implement the things that are of priority to you. And in talking to the sustainability director in Cleveland, what was interesting is those were not necessarily the action items that the sustainability team would have started with, but went ahead with those because they were the priorities of the neighborhood, and they really wanted to show a good faith effort in doing what the neighborhood wanted. And so as the projects moved forward, they came more and more in line with the city's goals. So for example, one of the things that a neighborhood wanted to do was to solarize a food pantry. And this was completed, and it also had the effect of a very visual reminder to members of the community what the climate action plan was doing in their neighborhood. Next. Dedicated funding streams to support projects in frontline communities. This is particularly difficult now. We know city and state governments have lost a lot of revenue in the pandemic and don't have the resources that they normally would. Some cities have been having ballot initiatives where residents agree to some dedication of sales tax to particular efforts. Some cities are relying on state programs that focus on frontline communities. In California, for example, their cap and trade program specifically dedicates a certain amount of its proceeds to low-income communities. States like Connecticut that have green banks might be a source of funding. But this is one thing that requires a bit of creativity on the part of many cities in identifying those funding streams that can come out of the tax base. I just talked to the sustainability director of Seattle the other day, and despite the fact that the city's budget is in question, the city did not reduce the amount of money going into their kind of green zone associated with their climate plan. And again, they just saw this as a priority item that they didn't want it to be the first thing that is eliminated when the budget gets cut. Next. Other measures. Again, I don't want to take up too much time here. So part of what we're doing is examining what other metrics there might be in terms of the outcomes in these communities. And partly those metrics are being co-created as well with the people in the community. So all in all, just to summarize, I think in these 5 cities, we see a really sincere effort to promote equity. I would argue Providence and Austin have gone further than any city that I know of at this point. And so looking forward to hearing from Leah about how they went about their plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. And I understand you have a forthcoming paper based on the research with your 5 cities. And we will make sure that that is available to everyone who's watching this webinar when it's ready, when it's published.
Well,
let's turn now.
Academic review processes being what they are, it might be a while.
All right, well, we'll wait. And let's turn now to Leah Bamberger, Director of Sustainability for the City of Providence.
Great. Can everyone hear me and see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks for having me. It's great to reconnect with the Boston community. I see many familiar names in the attendee list, so great to see everyone virtually. And I've been here in Providence for 5.5 years now, and yeah, have been really picking up kind of where we left off in Boston. When I left, we had just released the 2014 climate action plan update, and started in that plan really thinking about equity. And when I came to Providence, I had the opportunity to do some trainings and receive a grant that helped fund the initial work we did with the Equity and Sustainability Initiative. So it's important context for this work because it does take a lot of time, and it's not a process that you can kind of just start and expect the different outcomes. I think it takes a lot of time to build relationships and trust with community. And for the first few years in doing this work, focusing on the Equity and Sustainability Initiative, we didn't really talk about carbon or climate goals, or we really focused on racial equity for a couple of years before we were able to kind of transition and talk about, all right, now that we have this shared language and understanding, how does that apply to the climate work that we hope to do in Providence? So just a little bit of kind of context and background in Providence. I think this Providence is a really interesting place to be doing this work because it is essentially home to the birth of the Industrial Revolution in this country. And that is the root of this problem, right? So the emissions that started resulting from the Industrial Revolution, we're grappling with this today. But it's not just about carbon emissions. What we are really trying to connect here is the impact that this had. It was the extraction of labor. It was the extraction of people, enslaved people in particular from Africa, who were brought over to cotton plantations that came up to the north to make the textiles and the whole slave trade that built really capitalism as we know it today, and the interconnectedness of these issues we're still dealing with, right? We have the legacy of the impact this has had on our land, right? We have contaminated soils. We, of course, have the carbon emissions that we're trying to deal with, and we still are seeing an extraction of human labor that is very much unhealthy for us as a society. So in Providence, when we looked at, we have a goal to be carbon neutral by 2050, and we looked at where would we be if we did nothing, right? Given the policies that we have today, of course, we learned expectedly that we would not meet our carbon goals. So the Climate Justice Plan is designed to help us get on track to meeting our carbon goals, but also address these legacy impacts. specifically focused around our environmental justice communities. So we started by really focusing on the definition of who, right? Who are the people that we need to be centering in this process? And we worked with our frontline communities to define not only the geographic bounds, but more specifically the people within those communities that we should be focusing on our engagement. Who is most impacted by our environmental degradation, and who has the most at stake here? And so we use the environmental justice screening tool, EPA's tool, and we also talk to people in these communities via the Racial and Environmental Justice Committee. That committee, the REJC, was created when we started the equity and sustainability work 5 years ago. They are a group of 10 or so community members who represent various neighborhoods, or we have, there's like 10 seats. Some are neighborhood specific seats. We have a racial justice seat, an environmental justice seat, an indigenous seat, and a youth and education seat. And so we are representing with that committee various perspectives on those who are most impacted. So I think the important note here is that you know, we use the term frontline communities. Some places use different terminology, but I think the most important thing is to talk to and let the communities that you're working with sort of define who and how they are. You know, we try to, some folks prefer other terms, but letting people kind of define how they want to be described is very important. So some of the issues that we are addressing here and dealing with, again, these historic, some of this is historic legacy issues, and some are just the health impacts that we're grappling with from climate change and other factors. So Providence has some of the highest asthma rates in the state and actually in the country. And there are specific neighborhoods within that are disproportionately burdened. Even when you hold constant income, based on Medicaid data, we're still seeing pockets of higher rates in asthma in these frontline communities, similar to this map here. And on top of that, we also have extremely high lead levels in kindergarten age children in Providence. These numbers are extraordinarily high for for anywhere, but particularly for a developed country. This is an issue based on not necessarily water, although that is a contributing factor, but mostly about lead in homes and soil that is poisoning children in the city. This is from 2014. We've made some progress, but it's still an ongoing challenge. So the point here is to demonstrate the layers of impacts that these communities are facing, resulting from environmental burdens and also socioeconomic factors, of course, and could show many more slides about unemployment rate, income, education, all concentrated in these same areas. And of course, looking ahead at the impacts of climate change, we have the Providence waterfront is the industrial, let's see if you can you see my mouse by any chance on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so here we have the industrial port of Providence. This is South Providence and Washington Park, low-income community of color. This is this area here. There's all sorts of storage tanks, gas and fossil fuel infrastructure. There's a cement processing facility, all sorts of things that if the area flooded, it would be catastrophic. Our hurricane barrier, which protects the downtown, is right here. That, of course, does not protect this area here, but it does in theory, for so long as the infrastructure performs as it's intended to, it should protect downtown. And then you can't really see it, but over this side is Olneyville, and it's another a focus area of environmental justice communities where there's been historic flooding of the river. So in terms of our process, I want to first just talk about targeted universalism. And I love the story of the OXO vegetable peeler to kind of convey this approach. So many years ago, a gentleman's mother was having trouble using this metal vegetable peeler because she had arthritis. So he went out and designed ultimately what became this black model here that many of us probably have in our kitchen drawer today. And the idea here is if you design, and this is a far superior product than the metal one for anyone to use. And if you design with people with disabilities or the most marginalized in society, you'll end up with a better product that works. It works better for everyone, right? It's a classic example of when we talk about universal design for ADA accessibility, right? If you do stairs or a ramp, well, we could have both, but if we can only do one, let's do a ramp because everyone can use that, right? And it's not going to disenfranchise everyone. So what we did in our process is really focus on the most impacted, the most marginalized, the most disenfranchised community members, and design solutions in our climate action plan, which ultimately ended up being called our climate justice plan, design solutions that work for them, and we'll end up with solutions that improve the lives of everyone in the community. I think another good example, if you think about traffic solutions, right? If you're trying to deal with congestion and you talk to folks who have the most access, those are folks probably who get in their car and drive to work on most days. If you design solutions that work for them, you're going to end up with more highways. But if you talk to people who rely on public transportation, who don't have that sort of access, it's harder work up front to get the feedback from them because they're probably spending a lot of time riding public transportation rather than engaging in these sorts of conversations. But if you talk to those folks, you'll end up with better public transportation solutions, and you'll alleviate congestion. And then for the folks who do need to drive, they'll have less congestion to deal with as well. So through this process, we really continue to center equity in the process. So the first thing we did is we partnered with the Racial Environmental Justice Committee, and they led the community-centered process. So they helped design the process from the get-go. And they started by doing a community-led education and training on energy democracy. So we recognize up front that, we started with a very small group from the REJC of folks that were engaged in participating in this work. These members are all paid to do this work, but we knew we needed to engage more people, and we knew that was a challenge because of the barriers of understanding our energy system and so on. So we wanted to do this training and education first, and they led that process over the summer. From there, the folks who were trained went into their communities and did interviews of their fellow community members. These are interviews that took place around the kitchen table, pre-COVID times, barbecues, this is just things that people did on their own times in their community. And they asked very simple questions. They asked, how do you stay warm in the winter? What's good about that? What do you not like about it? How do you stay cool in the summer? What's good about that? What would you change? How do you get around the city? What's good about it? What would you change? And is there anything in your community that's making you sick? And we use the feedback from those interviews to design solutions based on what we heard. And we also were partnering with Acadia Center, who was helping come up with a menu of policy and programs that would help us meet our carbon neutral goal. And we took those policy solutions and we looked at the priorities and concerns from those interviews, and we made sure that the policy solutions address every single one of those priorities and concerns that we heard from frontline communities. What that meant is that it was a long process of REJC members and my team and Acadia in meetings talking through, is this policy or program equitable? What priority or what concern is it addressing that we heard? Is there any priority and concern that these policies don't address? Do we need to add anything? And just really making sure we avoided any negative unintended consequences from the policies. Some of the policies that meant couldn't be part of the plan, and it also meant that we had to come up with new ones. So as an example, in the climate justice plan, we have things like end utility shutoffs. That doesn't necessarily have a direct CO2 reduction, but it was something that was really important to our community, the frontline communities of Providence. And it, of course, is an important part of our energy system. So as we're thinking about changes to our energy system, we need to not just be thinking about those carbon reduction goals, but a holistic transformation to a more democratic, just, and low carbon energy system. Same goes for transportation, housing, et cetera. So once we had this list of policies and programs, it was a very comprehensive list. It was exhaustive, and it was really difficult. What we need to do is take it back to the community and say, this is what we heard. Here are the solutions that we came up with. What do you think? Did we miss anything? And that, reflecting back, was going to be, we saw the long list of policies and programs. Some of it was very complex and wonky, and it was a challenge. How do we communicate this back? So we came up with these future stories that I'll talk more about as a way to communicate that back. So a few just points to, well, I'll share, I guess, the next slide here. These are some things that we heard just to kind of illustrate the feedback that we were in the priorities and concerns that we were working with. So I'll read one of them. Every time our community gets cleaned up, white folks want it and start moving us out. We need to make sure we won't get kicked out before we push to make good things happen. So this is, again, illustrative of why we need those comprehensive solutions and things like end utility shutoff as we're working towards creating a lower carbon energy system. Another just point I would make on the engagement process is that, one, we worked with a very small group of community members to develop this plan. You don't need a community meeting of hundreds of people weighing in on your process. We had no open kind of public meetings about this process. It was very targeted. It was very intentional. The minute we did that because we knew as soon as we opened it up and said, hey, everyone, like, come share your ideas and share your feedback, we would get all of the usual suspects, and the voices that we were actually trying to uplift in this process would be marginalized. That is the way typical planning processes work. So we really flipped the entire process on its head. Another important part of kind of the process is this work that we developed with some other teams of consultants. Movement Strategy Center was a part of this, and a few others, the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. And this is a really important tool for us that helps inform our work. So kind of building off of Joan's talk around the engagement ladder and other kind of engagement models or tools, this certainly builds off of that. And goes on to explain how and help us understand where we are on the spectrum. That's the first thing you really need to be cognizant of. You want to know, is your process focusing on inform, or are you really working towards collaboration? And being clear with community where you are in this work is important. And it's also important to understand where you are, because you can't just jump. If you have historically operated at a 1, like your institution is informing folks, you can't just all of a sudden decide, hey, we're going to collaborate now, like we're woke, we're going to shift. You need to build and build that capacity both internally and externally in order to make progress, and it takes a lot of time. So again, back to my point earlier about you can't just jump into this work. You have to have the relationships and the trust and build capacity both within government to make the changes internally and within communities so that they have the capacity. And when you go to collaborate, there's people there that have time and have the resources and have the understanding of systems change and all of this work so that you can move forward. And hopefully get to community ownership. 5, defer to. That is what, it's like the revolution, right? We may never get there, or hopefully we do, but we want to be moving across that spectrum. And I mentioned the stories that we use. So these are available on our website. And again, this was a really helpful technique to share, what would Providence look like? What would your community look like? What would your lived experience, how would it be different in your community if we implemented all these policies and programs in the Climate Justice Plan? And yeah, so it's a very helpful engagement strategy or tool to think about how you can communicate this change and make it understandable to community members and relevant. And I think it's been really useful for us in our process. And I highly encourage you to listen to a few of them. I believe there's 9 in total. They're short. There's SoundCloud clips that you can listen to online. And so some things that, unfortunately, as was mentioned, my partner in this work, or one of our partners in this work, Monica Huertas, was unable to join us today. But they are now working on, the REJC is working on implementing green justice zones in Olneyville and in South Providence. And these are designed to really take this plan into those neighborhoods, our primary environmental justice communities, and continue to build the capacity so that we can implement programs and policies specific to those neighborhoods, and that make sure that it's community driven as much as possible. And so they're starting that work already. They were able to initiate it even back in the spring, in the sort of height of the pandemic, because of the relationships that we already had started to build. So I've been talking for a while. I'll leave it at that, but I'll welcome to open up to questions later.
Leah, that was really wonderful. Thank you for just giving us such a deep insight into what you've been doing in Providence and really leading the way on this work. So I know there's a lot of questions for you toward the end, or after we have one more presentation from Kat and Zoe in Boston. And just to remind everybody to please put your questions into the chat for all of the panelists, and I'm taking note, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the remaining half hour or so. And Kat and Zoe, we're running a little bit behind, but you all can go a little bit over 9 if you want. I know we've cut your time a little bit here, and look forward to hearing about where Boston is on all this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Amy and Joan, for setting us up, and great always to hear from Leah's work in Providence. It's a real source of inspiration for our own work here in Boston. So my name is Kat Eschel. As Amy mentioned, I'm the Carbon Neutrality Program Manager for Boston, and my colleague Zoe Davis and I will be sharing a little bit about equity and climate action planning and implementation here in Boston and how that practice has been evolving. Next slide, please. So as you may know, Boston is anticipating extreme heat, stormwater, flooding, and coastal river flooding in low-lying neighborhoods along the waterfront, possibly every month looking into the future. And we know that these impacts will disproportionately affect people who are more vulnerable to climate hazards due to life circumstances. So that can be poverty, poor health, limited English proficiency. Next slide. And so that's why Boston has 2 core climate goals: to become a carbon neutral city by 2050 and to prepare for the impacts of climate change. And as part of our commitment to climate action, we've developed a vision of what a resilient carbon neutral Boston can look like, with the knowledge that climate action doesn't just have climate benefits. We can protect our coastal community and create resilient, accessible open spaces, and we can prepare our buildings and infrastructure. And the benefits of carbon reduction are also reflected in cleaner air and better quality of life. This isn't just about carbon. But making this vision a reality is going to require sort of intentional planning and dedicated implementation. Next slide, please. And next one again. Okay. So Boston has a long history of climate action, and that practice has been evolving over time. So we released our very first plan in 2007 and had several updates since then in 2011, 2014, the one that Leah was involved in, and most recently in 2019. We've also ramped up our planning on adaptation since 2014 with the Climate Ready Boston initiative. And over the years, the city's approach to climate planning has really shifted as the profession itself evolves, as staff learn from one another and are inspired by other cities like Providence, and as we learn from and build relationships with our community here in Boston. And so we're going to share a little bit about how that's evolved since 2014. Next slide, please. And so I'm starting in 2014 because the 2014 Climate Action Plan update was the first to integrate social equity as a cross-cutting theme for implementation. And the plan affirmed two core principles: that minority and low-income communities must not be disproportionately impacted by climate hazards, which they currently are. And the second, that benefits from climate mitigation and preparedness efforts should be shared equally, or rather equitably, among all groups of people. And so the plan itself was developed based on a community consultation process. There was a community open house to generate that long list of strategies, and there were working groups focused on residential buildings, large buildings and institutions, transportation, adaptation, building a vision for cutting our emissions by 80%. And that all refined into a list of 100 or so strategies. The 2014 plan didn't necessarily go into detail as to what equitable implementation means for the different strategies, but it still holds the honor of being the first to reference equity as an organizing principle. Next slide, please. Another notable thing that the 2014 plan did was really lay the groundwork for our approach to adaptation planning and the Climate Ready Boston initiative. And one of the sort of foundational pieces in Climate Ready Boston was the social vulnerability assessment. And it's really a reference point that continues to inform all of our team's planning efforts through today. It was all about building a spatial understanding of the who and who is impacted by climate hazards. And so it mapped out 6 socially vulnerable population types, although we know that there are other ways in which we can be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we know that these identities often intersect and compound. But mapping that impact and identifying who may be impacted informs our understanding of what structural inequities are in place and sort of the context in which we're navigating. And it tells us who we need to be speaking with and working with to develop new policy programs and plans to help address those structural inequities and make sure that we're upholding those 2 core principles laid out in the 2014 plan. Next slide, please. The social vulnerability assessment also helped to inform the social equity analysis conducted in Carbon Free Boston. Carbon Free Boston was a study conducted by the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy and the Green Ribbon Commission, our partners, and it was released in 2019. And so the social equity analysis assessed the potential equity implications of decarbonization policies and technologies. And it helped to underscore the importance of intentional design ultimately. And the final report included scorecards for each policy to inform efforts to integrate equity during carbon reduction policy and program planning and implementation. And so it's really all about sort of building on past work of that mapping, helping to inform this analysis, which then informed future planning. So there's always this through line where past work is informing current work. Next slide, please. So in the 2019 Climate Action Plan update, we took things a step further. We sought to integrate equity and public participation in various stages of the process and in different ways. So kind of working towards the procedural equity and the equity outcomes that Joan was referring to during her presentation. So during the procurement process, we included a simple Google form to allow interested bidders to match skills and build teams. And we included diversity and being rooted in Boston's communities as one of the criteria for selection. And so as a result, we actually ended up contracting with a team that used that matching form. So they built a team by matching skills and banding together. And we worked with a team that was composed largely of people who identify as women and with LGBTQ, minority, and women-owned firms. And so this in turn influenced the process itself. The engagement process included a street team of volunteers, primarily youth from communities of color in Boston, who were trained and compensated for their time. And they went out to community events to raise awareness and hear from community members, residents, what their concerns were and what their priorities were for climate action. We also created a community working group and specifically reached out to previously underrepresented communities. So kind of going to Leah's point of the usual suspects in the room always showing up, but wanting to make sure that we were really proactively reaching out to groups that were less likely to show up on their own and offering to go to where they are and present directly to them. Within the plan itself, in the strategies piece, we wanted to go beyond prioritizing strategies and build a common vision with the working group about what implementing each of the strategies looks like, talking about how we can design for equity in each one and talking about what success looks like and writing that into the plan. So at the bottom right here, you have a segment from our workforce development strategy around designing for equity and metrics for success in that space. And then we also know that equity goes into how you share out results. So we've translated the Climate Ready Boston reports in the past and the 2019 Climate Action Plan update as an accessible interactive summary online in Boston's 6 major languages. We have a lot more to do, but we're on our way from a language justice standpoint. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, with each process, we're getting a little better and we're pushing ourselves further. And so that goes into the implementation of the 2019 Climate Action Plan update as well. So, for example, in the development of our building emissions performance standard, it's the single most impactful action that we can take from a carbon standpoint, but that's not the only impact we're considering. These are also people's homes, their offices, it's their favorite restaurant, it's our doctor's offices. And so part of the project is a technical analysis with an advisory group made up of building and energy sector experts, but on a co-equal level, we've been working with a resident advisory group to center impacted communities in our policy development. So working with One Square World, Alternatives for Community and Environment, we're essentially engaged in a visioning process to translate some of that really complex, wonky policy language into language that your aunt or your cousin might understand. We're raising awareness of the opportunities linked to this policy and hearing residents' stories. And so for our outreach efforts, we sort of, again, use that mapping exercise to figure out where these multifamily buildings are located, and then working directly with community groups and compensating them for their labor as well to tap into their networks and get people into the Zoom room where we're sort of sharing stories and engaging in this visioning process together. We're also sort of improving our language justice strategies. We're doing systematic interpretation and translation to Spanish and Cantonese. We have multilingual outreach, and generally the people who are participating, they're contributing expertise from their lived experiences, and we're compensating them for that expertise. And what they say in turn is shaping policy design. So sort of to what Leah was saying earlier, we're still not at 5 and at defer to and community ownership, but we're trying to edge up on the spectrum every time. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zoe.
Thanks so much, Kat. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking more specifically on Climate Ready Boston and the coastal and heat resilience initiatives that are ongoing, and how we're integrating equity into those planning processes. So Climate Ready Boston, as Kat mentioned earlier, is the city's initiative to develop resilient solutions to prepare infrastructure and residents and natural resources for the long-term impacts of climate change. The 2016 report became the framework for the city's climate adaptation initiatives moving forward. And so there are 4 main components of the report, including 1, updated climate projections for flooding so that we can understand where the flooding will occur and how much. And when we're thinking about flooding, we're looking at sea level rise as well as increased precipitation, flooding from increased precipitation. And it also gave us projections on where we would see increased heat, as well as a current map of heat islands in the city. In addition, the 2016 report also included a vulnerability assessment, as Kat had mentioned earlier, so that we can understand who was being affected and what was being affected under both the current conditions as well as future ones. And from this, focus areas were identified where there was an overlap of climate risk with social vulnerability. And from all 3 of these things, a set of climate resilience initiatives were developed to address the identified risks and vulnerabilities. And so the climate efforts that I'm going to touch on today intend to further identify which resilience initiatives are not specific to neighborhoods across the city. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the vulnerability assessment identified 4 major hazards from the climate projections. And these are, as you can see, extreme temperatures and precipitation, sea level rise, and coastal and coastal storms. And from these were identified 3 major risks within the city. So coastal and riverine flooding, stormwater flooding, and extreme heat risk. And as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on the coastal flooding and heat resilience pieces from this. Next slide, please. So focusing in on coastal resilience planning, we take a district scale approach with the understanding that each neighborhood is unique, not only in its topography, but also in its communities and the composition of its communities. So this neighborhood specific planning has the goal of developing near and long-term risk reduction strategies for coastal flooding and sea level rise that's specific to the shoreline and the population. And in planning for future risk, understanding the needs that are specific to each community is really critical to developing solutions that work for the people who are experiencing the effects of climate change right now in that space. And so the goal here is that solutions not only reduce climate risk, but they also enhance social resilience. So these solutions, we look to develop solutions that that are developing strategies that equitably reduce coastal risk, but that also enhance mobility and connectivity, and also promote the health of ecosystems and natural spaces that are valuable to communities. So during the early stages of the planning process and engagement, we have community identified values, which we call as part of the evaluation criteria. And these help to determine what type of resilience solutions can work in a space. And so on the right, this is an example of evaluation criteria that we use during these processes that's developed with communities and is revisited as solutions are developing, so that we can check back to see what are the values that are being addressed and represented in the solutions. Next slide, please. So focusing and transitioning into heat resilience, what you're looking at here is a series of heat vulnerability maps that were completed with the 2016 assessment. And these are showing the hottest areas across the city overlaid with population data. That includes the distribution of children and older adults, as well as residents with medical illnesses. And what this has given us is an understanding of where populations of folks who are more susceptible to heat risk are within the city. And this information and this basis of understanding has been critical to the development of a planning process that focuses on vulnerable populations, integrating them into the process, understanding what solutions will work for them. So I will touch on that in just a bit. Next slide, please. So in addition to understanding the current risk, the climate projections gave us an understanding of how urban heat will progress over the century and a comparison of what we're seeing now to what will be occurring in the future. Last summer was the hottest for Boston on record, where we're currently experiencing an average of 11 days over 90 degrees. But by the end of the century, we could be seeing up to 90 days above 90 degrees, with about a third of those high heat days above 100 degrees. So more days, more high heat days means more heat island exposure, which, as we know, poses a very real public health concern. So what we're thinking in our planning is trying to understand how we can develop long-term resilient strategies that will also mitigate public health risk equitably and adapt to future climate risk. Next slide, please. So what we're looking forward to and currently developing is conducting a comprehensive planning study with the goal of developing a citywide resilient strategy to prepare for the long-term impacts of urban heat. that will build off of the existing body of heat-related initiatives. So we're looking to identify heat adaptation strategies within the context of Boston's urban fabric and its community composition, thinking of structural and programmatic and policy level interventions. We're looking to identify metrics for heat risk and reduction so that we can measure the impacts of the interventions that are being developed. And to identify where certain strategies will have the greatest impact. And finally, also to identify the implementation timeline so that we can understand by when interventions should be in place. So we're focusing the engagement process and the development of solutions with communities located in the major hotspots that overlap with priority communities. So we're thinking of immigrant communities, communities of color, lower income communities in the neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, East Boston, and Chinatown. And the approach that we're taking to this process is really to center the voices of community people through a process that by engaging them in the process from procurement through the development of solutions to the presentation of the findings. And to do this, as I mentioned, we're focusing community engagement and the development of solutions with these communities and having community members be a part of the data collection on the project team, working with the project team. And also by setting the foundation of the project in a social equity framework, grounding it in this framework and moving forward through it by recognizing the history of underinvestment through various development practices and understanding how that has affected communities of color and immigrant communities moving forward. So in this process, as Kat had mentioned before, we're sort of working up towards that level of integration and co-creation with communities.
Great. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Kat. It's now time to turn to our Q&A. And I think everybody can come off mute and we can come to the group display here. So many questions from the audience, and one just came in that was really striking me. So I'm just gonna read this, and I think this is a question for probably to start with for Leah, but then Kat and Zoe, if you want to chime in. It seems like Boston is gaining information and setting priorities on social resilience more from geolocated data analysis, and Providence is doing the same more through its standing REJC and community engagement. And would you say that's correct? And Leah, as someone who's worked in both cities, could you sort of talk about the difference and any lessons learned or recommendations you might have for Boston?
Sure, I'll do my best. So the first part of that question, I guess how I would answer is saying, like, yes, we are definitely at this point prioritizing input and information that's coming from our frontline communities in Providence. And I think part of the reason for that is that these are communities that certainly have a valuable lived experience that is necessary to address the problem in its entirety. And also these are communities and perspectives and voices that have not had a seat at the table for decades, centuries, if ever, in our kind of societal context. So creating space for them is really important. It needs to be intentional. And we have sort of heard so much already from the traditional white-led environmental community, and the environmental justice community has not really had that seat at the table. So we're kind of trying to balance those scales a bit. So I think I hope that answers that first part of the question. And then in terms of just comparison, I don't even know how to answer that question. It's been really challenging.
A little bit of a
feel like when
question.
When I first came down to Providence, I was always thinking like, oh, well, you know, from a policy perspective, Boston is very much ahead, right? And they have, I think, a lot more partnerships like the GRC and the universities that are heavily involved in this sort of work. And so there's a lot of data and information. In Rhode Island, we do have a lot of that, particularly around URI does amazing research around mapping and climate impacts. So we do have that. We have a good, you know, set of information around climate resilience. We haven't, I don't think, like put the pieces together in the same way that Boston has, bringing that into, like, we don't have that structure for partnerships. There's some attempt at that to start that in Providence, but with the work that we're doing in equity, I feel like I'm a little bit cautious about creating a powerful body equivalent to the GRC because of the dominant nature and the power that it does hold from various, you know, whether it's corporate or executive, the leadership is very powerful, and I just am wanting it, I'm hopeful that we can have it be very intentional to make sure it doesn't overpower the work that we're already doing. And an example of that is when the Climate Justice Plan was being finalized, we had a pretty powerful voice come into the mayor's office and express concern. So this is someone very much connected and representing downtown business interests and real estate. And they were concerned. They weren't a part of the process. They didn't think the plan was, you know, tackling climate resilience enough. And I think just didn't appreciate not really being a part of the process. And fortunately, our leadership didn't really pay much attention to that. We had some additional review that we went through internally to make sure everyone was okay with what was in the plan. But it was just an example of how those interests can come in. And for a moment, I was concerned that it was going to really derail the release of our plan and the entire process. So that's a difference. The other, I guess, difference I would say is just the size and scale of community is obviously very different. You know, Boston is still a fairly small city, but compared to Providence, we're teeny. We're 23, 25 square miles. We have 108,000 people in the city. So it's a totally different scale, and within government too. It's you know, my office we have 4 full-time staff. And so we're very collaborative internally in government, and so it's just it's a very different kind of beast, I'd say.
Let me just jump in and give Zoe and Kat an opportunity to comment.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very interesting observation. I really appreciate that observation. I think specifically for the heat resilience piece, working with the maps and sort of identifying the areas where heat resilience is needed is sort of the first piece there. It's the first step. This is what this analysis has shown us. This is what it is that we're seeing. The next step is to ground truth that. And this is where we're trying to be fully integrated with what communities are saying, because it is very clear that we can't develop solutions for people if the people that we're trying to develop solutions for aren't present. And even to that end, we shouldn't be developing solutions for people. We should be developing it with them, because they're living heat risk daily, yearly. So I appreciate that as a, you know, and something that Boston is doing. But it is our starting place, but it's certainly not where we hope to finish and end. In the process that we're developing, both for heat resilience and for the newest coastal resilience planning effort in East Boston and Charlestown, we're trying to develop a set of community advisory boards that are specific to the planning areas, so that they can, you know, not only help us connect with their communities, not only give input, but really be shaping the project with us. And so going back to the evaluation criteria, you know, rather than just saying, here we have these criteria that might matter to you, going back multiple times and saying, we've been using these evaluation criteria for the past, you know, 2 years in planning. Does this work for this area of East Boston and Charlestown? Does this work for your community? Are there things that we're not even thinking of in these criteria? And I think even more than that, understanding that, you know, climate issues don't happen in a vacuum. So yes, we're planning for coastal resilience, and yes, we're planning for heat resilience in the long term. But there are so many compounding factors, you know, such as transportation and housing affordability. And so understanding what that looks like on the ground is really critical to how we're integrating it into the solutions that come out.
Yeah, thank you. And Joan, I might just use that as a springboard to circle around to you. I think you mentioned community science, and whether that provides some connective tissue between the data-based side and the neighborhood-based side, because both are obviously essential, as we've just heard.
Yeah, this is something, in fact, we are doing a workshop next week at Northeastern on just this topic. And so we're having someone from the Conservation Law Foundation, Rhianne Gibson, who's engaged in community science, as well as David Sittenfeld from the Museum of Science, and then Ms. Margaret Gibson from West Oakland. And in each case, what they've done is, a lot of times the type of data you need, whether it's urban heat island or levels of pollution, aren't gathered at the micro scale or the neighborhood scale to really tell what's going on. And so often this involves residents you know, sitting at an intersection at different times of day and with monitors measuring pollution levels, or residents monitoring rainwater, or taking temperatures at different times of the day. And so you get a level of engagement and participation, and then they're involved in developing the solutions as well. It's a very powerful approach.
So also, you know, stepping back a minute and looking at your overall research into, I think you must have scanned 75 cities to arrive at the 5 that you ended up focusing on as sort of leaders. What kind of conditions would you, or leadership prevailed in those cities, or maybe nothing prevailed, maybe it was different in each case, that encouraged the cities to go down this sort of leading edge path on participatory climate justice versus the more traditional, what we think of as a regular climate action plan?
Mm-hmm. Let me clarify. I think these are leading cities. I wouldn't say they're the leading cities. For example, Seattle is a real leader on this as well, but I didn't include it in this particular study. In each case, I'd say it's an aha moment that happens somewhere in city government. And the story is, Leah told me that as soon as she came on, people from the frontline community started approaching her about more inclusiveness in the planning, and she was on board. In Cleveland, the mayor was very committed to this and brought on a new a sustainability director and realized they had been talking equity for quite some time, but nothing was happening. And so it came from the mayor of, we really need to change the way we're doing this. Austin, I think it came out of a realization of just a horrible history of segregation. So this moment, I think COVID-19 is bringing that realization to a number of different cities. So on a smaller scale, Ann Arbor, also in the midst of the pandemic, redoing their plan and building it around equity. So I suspect that COVID will be a wake-up call for a lot of cities to realize there's a public health element to climate change. There's a justice element, and we'll see movement in that direction.
That's a good segue into something that I was hoping to talk to certainly the City of Boston and Providence about, and that is, how is COVID affecting your work now? And looking to the future, you know, we've got in both cities, I know Boston a little better, you know, the mayor has set extremely aggressive climate goals, and it is no small feat to move a city of Boston's size, even though I guess we're sort of a middle-sized city, you know, to meeting that carbon neutral goal and the climate ready goal as well by 2050. So how do you balance that kind of you know, very physical, real imperative with what's going on with COVID, and how is it affecting your work now? But more to the point, how do you see it changing things in the future? I don't know, that might be a cat question.
Yeah, I can kick us off. In terms of sort of direct day-to-day effects, I mean, like so many people, so many white-collar workers in particular, obviously working remotely and taking public meetings online has been an interesting experience. It has been really interesting, I think, learning from the accessibility community. I've seen attendance at public meetings skyrocket, and that's just because people aren't having to travel in the dead of night to go to a public meeting across town. Instead, they can connect from their living room if they have internet access or phone access. And so it's been actually kind of interesting seeing how that's improved. We're still learning a lot. It isn't smooth by any means. Language access in particular, I think, is still a really big challenge, as well as having more consistent integration of American Sign Language. But certainly it's definitely changed the dynamics a lot in terms of who can access a public meeting. In terms of our recovery, one of the documents that we're looking towards is C40, the Organization of International Cities Working Together on Climate Action, actually put together a series of principles for a just recovery from COVID-19. And so as we think about our work, I think we're kind of following suit along with a lot of other cities in terms of, well, how can we respond to this public health emergency while also achieving our goals? And very often those goals are consistent with one another. So thinking about public health in some planning that we're doing right now in the building performance standard, the intersections between indoor air quality, outdoor air quality, and building decarbonization are there. It's been pretty shocking to realize yet again the health impact of gas stoves as opposed to an induction burner. And so these are there are real co-benefits to this action. These benefits are equal and they're equally important. And it's sometimes those shared benefits of climate action are actually the best possible reason for doing it. So another example is things like community choice energy, where the city is bulk buying electricity on behalf of residents. Not only is it a way to access clean energy, but it's also a secure and affordable way to access clean energy. We have a real problem in Massachusetts with predatory third-party energy suppliers, door knocking. When we look at the data, again, informing our understanding, there's a lot of people in these contracts in neighborhoods like Mattapan, Roxbury. So there's a real dynamic going on there, and the Attorney General's office is certainly taking action there. But a product that's really actually just a good consumer protection measure also has sort of these ancillary climate benefits. The original
Yeah.
impetus for creating that program was climate, but the real benefits are actually elsewhere. And so I think it's more of identifying those ways to build back better that actually just get us closer towards the vision of where we want to be, which is a resilient city. And if COVID has shown us anything, it's how adaptable we are, but also how fragile our systems have been. And so as we build back better, it's sort of how can you make sure that the solution is meeting not just your short-term problem, but also makes sense for your long-term goals.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Leah, do you want to, we have about a couple more minutes. I want to get in one more question, but Leah, do you have a sort of a any quick thoughts on that?
You can go ahead with the next question.
Okay, the next question, and you raised it, you touched on it, Kat, is someone asked about in participatory planning the question of language and translation, and despite the efforts that are usually often made to have interpreters, that sometimes people's thoughts will nevertheless get kind of like simplified, so complexities don't always get translated, and this person was, I guess the questioner was asking basically about having more people on staff who are native, in the cities, in the planning departments and in the environment and sustainability departments who speak more languages, basically, and whether there's any, do you share that perception of that problem, and how are you thinking about it? I'll let you kick off, Leah.
Sure. So yes, that is certainly a challenge, and I think a step in the right direction is to have more native speakers of various languages. But we're also never going to cover all the bases, right? Even when we're trying to translate something into Spanish, we go back and forth. Well, in Honduras, it's this way. In Guatemala, it's this way. And so there's no, it's a very, very challenging and laborious process to try to get it right, especially when you're dealing with important legal documents where wording is very, very important. So I think, and also thinking again about targeting universalism, how do we make all of this documents or work as simple, as straightforward and clear as possible, and thinking about other ways of communicating it beyond just the written word.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
Just real quick to say that I've actually seen the benefit of having multilingual folks on staff firsthand. Our transportation department has been doing some engagement around bike lanes on American Legion Highway, and they actually have a Spanish speaker on staff, so they were able to do community meetings wholly in Spanish as well as wholly in English, and it does change the dynamic. I think it's impossible to fully plan for all the accommodations that you may need. Surprises always occur. For us recently, we've been doing a lot of Cantonese interpretation, but there's a huge Taishanese population in Chinatown that apparently it's just everybody from this one village in China came over and they live in Chinatown and they all still speak Taishanese. And so even if you had planned for the Cantonese interpretation, you maybe didn't plan for the Taishanese interpretation. And so it's always a learning effort, but there's a real asset to having multilingual people on staff, if only because it does sort of build your affinity for understanding sort of the limitations of interpretation and translation and how difficult it can be, and the need to really plan for it and budget for it in your processes. That's still something we're still learning and growing in this space, but it really can be just a huge asset to have multilingual folks on staff. You may not always have the right language. I speak French. That's not very useful in Boston, but it's at least a language.
But it's the language of diplomats.
Et voilà.
Okay, on that note, and I think, the opportunities to go deeper and wider on this subject are just about infinite. Thank you to everyone who's watching this GRCx program, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today. Joan, Kat, Zoe, Leah, it was just, I would like to have you all back again every single month and just follow the progress here. But please do, you'll all receive a a notice with how to reach the YouTube version of this. If you want to share the recorded version with colleagues, that'll be out in a couple of days, and you'll all receive the invitation to our next GRCx program, which is going to be on the potential of networked geothermal systems, which should be very exciting. And John will be hosting that on November 19th, back to our regular 8:30 time slot. Thank you all. Goodbye.